Good afternoon and welcome to the MLK Day celebration. I would like to thank all of you for coming out to join us today as we reflect and celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His life began on January 15th, 1929 and ended on April 4th, 1968 at the age of 39. I would like to share a passage with you from Dr. King as he once spoke about how he wished to be remembered after his death. I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. I'd like for somebody to say that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to say that day that I tried to be right on the war question. I want you to be able to say that I did try to feed the hungry. I want you to be able to say that day that I did try in my life to clothe those who were naked. I want you to say on that day that I did try in my life to visit those who were in prison. And I want you to say that I tried to love and serve humanity. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness. And all the other shallow things will not matter. What a legacy, a universal hope for all mankind. At this moment, I would like to introduce to you a special musical and spoken word performance featuring Miss Lena Wegner from Communications on vocals, singing A Change Is Gonna Come, Miss Cassandra Lyons Johnson delivering a spoken word piece entitled A Message to Martin, and Victor Moore, arranger keyboard. So at this time, I introduce to you the trio performance.
I was born by the river in a little tent. No, just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard living, and I'm afraid to die, 'cause I don't know what's out there beyond that sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know my change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
We know that you ransomed your life for a cause because you realized that a life without a purpose was meaningless and the situation was at hand. We know that your strength was not only yours, but it came from God, to whom your prayers were ever flowing. Just wanted to tell you that our day is different because of you. Racial lines are fading in families, in friendships, in our causes, in our decisions, in prosperity, and in war. Just wanted to tell you that the sacrifice of your life is still seriously remembered in the way we live, work, play. Millions believe in you as a real man with a dream, who believed in a God without end. You reminded us that blood is the same color in all of us, like pain, like poverty, like death, like hope and laughter. You made so many of us believe in the core of our being that it is grand to embrace our diversities, to allow our individuality, and that the true prosperity of our great United States is nourished on the table of sincere hope to make better the future for our colorful children. Because hatred is poison, money cannot be the only thing that matters, and that our dream, your dream, can, will be, and is our right now. Martin Luther King Jr. just wanted to give you this message of thanksgiving for the ages, because it is for truth that there is no greater love than you gave for our tomorrows.
Then I go to my brother, and I said, brother, help me, please. But he winds up knocking me back on my knees. There have been times that I thought I wouldn't last too long, but now I know I'm strong and able to carry on. It's been a long time coming, but I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
So much. Can you hear me? Now? Better? Okay, great. Thanks. At this time, I've had the pleasure of introducing to you our keynote speaker, and I'd like to share his biography with you. Dr. Delbert R. Wigfall is an associate clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics, Division of Pediatric Nephrology, and physician director of the Multicultural Resource Center for the School of Medicine. Dr. Wigfall was born in Charleston, South Carolina. He received a BA with honors in chemistry from Williams College and an MD from Emory University School of Medicine. He completed a residency in pediatrics at the University of Texas, Houston, Herman Hospital, and MD Anderson Cancer Center. After joining the faculty at Emory University as a clinical associate for 2 years, he completed a fellowship in pediatric nephrology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He joined the Duke faculty in 1987. Dr. Wigfall's clinical interests are in autoimmune kidney diseases, transplantation, and hypertension. He is currently the director of pediatric dialysis. He has championed the inclusion of cultural competency and communication through the evolution of Multicultural Resource Center. His work in this area has earned him recognition by the Honorable P. Gold Foundation as the 201 Humanism in Medicine Award recipient and inclusion as a new inductee in the Arnold P. Gold Humanism Honor Society in 2005. He was the recipient of an Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, the EDI Award, and was the recipient of the Blue Ribbon Diversity Award for Duke University Health System in 2007. He has been listed as one of the best doctors in America each year since 2005. I bring to you Dr. Delbert Wigfall.
Thank you very much, and thank you to your crew for inviting me to speak today. I hope that I'm audible. I'm trying to get on the better side of a cold, so I'll try to speak up. I must admit I'm prone to mumble, so I can put myself to sleep. Excuse me. It's hard to imagine that I am the person who was just introduced. It's hard to imagine that I remember so much about the civil rights era growing up in the South. I was a child of the Southeast and spent a lot of time, obviously, in a segregated South. And that was my norm, and it was not necessarily a vile place to be. It was actually a very warm and nurturing place to be in my family and in my community. 50 years ago, August, Dr. King gave his remarkable I Have a Dream speech. I chose this one passage. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we will face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream, and it's a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. Ultimately, that we live out the true meaning of the creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Everybody remembers his speech, and everybody remembers the passages from his speech, and it's been touted and it's been repeated, and there are thousands of kids who've repeated it at Martin Luther King celebrations across the country for decades. It's unfortunate that he died at such a young age. I decided to revisit, and Gina said, well, what's your topic? And I thought, Those of you who know me know that that's the usual way I respond. And it's been that way for a long time, over 50 years, unfortunately. But I chose how far we've come. It's a very interesting statement, and it's a very interesting way of thinking about what has transpired over the years since Dr. King walked among us. This one quote is one that I think has resonated with everyone in healthcare, and it's one that we hold dear even as we embrace the Affordable Care Act. Of all forms of inequality and injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane. As far as I'm concerned, there's no reason to even argue the point. Whether or not health and health care is a right or a privilege becomes inconsequential because everybody wants to feel good. And we want everyone that we care about to feel good. Or we want them to have every opportunity to get well when they're ill. So what I wanted to do today was to sort of look back just briefly at some of the issues that were existing in 1960 and look at health in that perspective and look at health care and health delivery today and look at the disparities in access to care, thinking that that might be something that would be of interest to this audience in particular. And then look at education as a solution. What I wanted to start with is something that probably it's difficult to put in perspective given those objectives. This sign, this placard, actually came from in front of a public market in St. Augustine, Florida. About 50 years ago, I lived in St. Augustine. And it was a public market that was established in 1598. So this was when Ponce de Leon was running around Florida and discovering wonderful places to live. This market was created, and it said it was a market for sale of meats and produce that burned and was re-erected in 1878, 1888, and opened back for public use. What is not said about it was that it was also a site of slave trade. And in 1963, it was also a site of protest. In June of 1963, Dr. Robert Haling, who was a black dentist in St. Augustine, organized a youth council as a local chapter of the NAACP, and they began to protest in the streets of St. Augustine and in front of Woolworths and in front of this plaza, carrying signs that ask, if we spend money here, why can't we eat here? What followed were sit-ins, 16 young black folks, including 7 juveniles, ultimately were arrested. The juveniles' parents were told or asked if they would keep their kids uninvolved in the activities of the NAACP, that they could be released to their custody. 3 said yes, the others said no, and those kids were sent away to reform school for 6 months. By the end of the summer, by September of '63, the anger had gotten so, it was increasing, largely because people wanted to sit down and talk. They wanted to have the opportunity to talk about racial discord in St. Augustine, but what they got instead was the backlash that so typified race relations in the early '60s in the South. Usually when you think of activities like this, we usually think about it in terms of Alabama and Mississippi. There's a lot of folks who would tell you that Northern Florida sometimes takes on the onus and the culture of those same areas. In the same month, the Ku Klux Klan organized, in September of 1963, a rally. Dr. Haling, that dentist, and 3 of his friends tried to observe the rally, and they were seized and beaten and saved, fortunately, at the last minute, and they were able to get out without any further harm. In March of that year, 1964, they asked Dr. King to come to St. Augustine, and he did. And he spoke at St. James Baptist Church. It's been updated and looks entirely different than it did back in 1964. The important thing was in this pulpit where Dr. King addressed the community, a little kid got to come up the side when he was still sitting in the pulpit and shake his hand and speak to him. It's hard to believe that that was 50 years ago. And it's hard to believe that I'm that kid. That in itself causes me a great deal of emotion because I realize what I've traveled through since that time and where Dr. King ultimately ended up. He ended up being escorted from town with a guard dog because the city decided after they had arrested him, and this was the only place in Florida where Dr. King was actually arrested, but he was escorted from town to answer the grand jury's request that he basically calm down or not aggravate the inflammatory situation that existed in St. Augustine at that time. He, of course, replied that this was a situation like most where the African American community, the Negro community, was being asked to concede and the white community was not doing anything to actually promote peace. But as I said, he was escorted out of town in a highway patrol car with a police dog. So how far have we come since that time? This is actually reminiscent of a lot of what happened during the civil rights struggle in the early to mid-'60s, up until the Voting Rights Act, the civil rights legislations. So what I'd like to do is take a look back, just in part, just briefly, at some of the issues that plagued the communities in the '60s. Violence. Violence is one of those things that has persisted. I mean, even now, you turn on the TV and the first thing you hear about is somebody else who's been shot. Unfortunately, people who are minding their own business. The kid was Rocky Mount just in the past week who was killed by a drive-by shooting. The kids who go to elementary school, you drop off your first grader and you find out he's been shot by somebody who's wandered into the school. You go to see a movie and you get killed. And the kinds of violence that are all so pervasive were pervasive even then. The thing that's really pretty startling about this is that when you start to look at this in the totality of things, this is the rate of homicides. And what you begin to see is here, male versus female, which is lower. But then this non-white, which clearly is inflamed way above the total population. And when you split that out for male and female, the persons of color flip way up again. So even at that point in time, this was an issue that was one that disparately affected communities of color. When we look at mortality in 1963 and compare that to 2003, I wanted to use 2013, but that data was not quite available that I could consume it quite in the same way. But what we've seen is what's been known, right? The mortality and morbidity, mortality related to heart disease, cancer, and cardiovascular disease have come down precipitously. The rest of these things really have not changed a lot. Diabetes, pulmonary disease, liver disease, accidents, suicides, homicides, just pointed out. All of these things are still very serious problems within our communities. When you look at heart disease and cancer, they're still the leading causes of death better than 50 years later. We've learned a whole lot more about how to treat them, how to make the early diagnosis and how to treat them aggressively. But people still die, unfortunately, from these conditions. And when you look at death rates overall, this was really pretty startling. So that looks great. People are still dying, and that's sort of inevitable. But what you see is the rates at which people are dying has precipitously declined, although the total number is higher, but the total population is higher. So things look like they're getting better, and theoretically they should be getting better over that same time frame. But what you start to appreciate is that there's a discordance between conditions that affect populations. I'm just showing you the black and white graphics here. And what you notice, and it's really pretty surprising in some respects to me, that you see heart disease and cancer that look almost the same. But over here, where you see suicide and a little bit of kidney disease and a variety of different conditions, you don't see HIV, you don't see septicemia, you don't see homicide to the same degree, you don't see kidney disease to the same degree. So parts of the kinds of human conditions that are causing death in our populations, there's disparate results between communities of color. The same kinds of graphics are available for every other ethnic or cultural group. And I chose not to go through all of those, but to list some of the causes of death by communities. So in the African American community, heart disease and cancer are there, but so is diabetes, HIV, septicemia, and kidney disease, which doesn't show up on the majority list. For Latinos, the same things are there, but now we have some unintentional injuries. We have cancer, and diabetes becomes a bigger cause of mortality in this population. In the American Indian and Alaska Natives, we know by clinical data that diabetes, alcoholism, suicide are problems that disparately affect these communities. So depending on where you live, even in the Asian population, what you don't see here is violence. You don't see any mortality related to violence. The same triumvirate sort of here at the top with cancer and heart disease and cardiovascular disease with stroke. Some injuries, some diabetes, again, some kidney disease. And there are some kidney conditions that disparately affect populations of color. Not the least of which is the appearance of focal segmental glomerulosclerosis in the African American community. So that there's a higher rate or higher risk of loss of kidney function and hypertension and all of the bad harbingers of outcome in communities of color across the country. So in terms of disparities, Black men and women are more likely to have heart failure, high blood pressure, and stroke, and Black women are more likely than other women to have coronary heart disease. Data that has come out of Duke has sort of demonstrated some disparate ways in which populations of color are treated with the same kinds of cardiovascular disease. And maybe this is in part contributing to these outcomes. Black men and women are more likely to die from heart disease than other groups. Minority women have lower rates of breast cancer but are more likely to die. The incidence from colorectal cancer is lower in some respects, but the mortality rates are higher. Black men are 50% more likely to have prostate cancer, but twice as likely to die from it. Hispanic women are twice as likely to have cervical cancer than whites. So these kinds of things are just repeated and persistent issues and where we are now in healthcare delivery. Blacks are more than 10 times likely and 3 times more likely than Hispanics to have AIDS. The larger population of folks who are adversely affected by HIV and AIDS are persons of color, and that's the largest growing population in terms of risk. Blacks and American Indians are more likely to suffer from asthma. Blacks are more likely to die. These things are issues that are known commodities, And in some respects, while a lot of attention, a lot of NIH money has been dedicated to the treatment of particularly heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and cancer, there's a burgeoning interest and even more need to pursue some of these other conditions that are equally as lethal to our communities. Now, some of what contributes to morbidity and mortality, we talk about different parameters, and particularly when it impacts our ability to seek or receive health care. One of the things is poverty. Across the world, impoverished folks are more likely to be ill and are more likely to have bad outcome. When you look at families who live below the poverty line, now this is older data, this is 2004, but I doubt real seriously that things look that different now. The blue is, I think, above between 100 and 200% of the federal poverty level, and the white below 100%. But basically what you see, which is not necessarily startling, is unfortunately a tendency for persons of color to live in a more impoverished environment. Now what that does, even with an increase in income, blacks are more likely than whites or Latinos to suffer from chronic disease. Now granted, these numbers are not necessarily terribly impressive when you look at them quantitatively, but qualitatively, it still makes a statement. It still means that we have issues that supplant some of what is probably a genetic predisposition to some diseases. When you start to look at insurance or insurability or access to insurance, again, the percentages of adults 18 to 64 who are uninsured, now this was in 2006 by income, is not necessarily startling, but even when you look at income levels, right, you still get the same kinds of splays where particularly persons of color here, again, are less likely to have adequate health care or health care coverage. In terms of where they go for care, now this is obviously more up to date, but I would argue that some of the same issues existed even in 1960. While we would like to think that it would be ideal to seek care in a doctor's office or in a private clinic, when you start to look particularly at Black and Hispanics, you notice that there's a more use of community access points or the emergency room. A lot of folks who don't get care at all or use the hospital. So a lot of what has been misdirected utilization of healthcare facilities has been attributed to persons of color across the country. But is this an issue that's probably more relevant to income and lack of insurability or insurance? Well, let's talk about something else other than access and use infant mortality, because now these are nice clean numbers that we can look back to 1960. And the thing that's really pretty impressive is that while the total infant mortality rate, so this was 25% of 1,000 live births, were lost to fetal death or to neonatal death in 1960. Now we're down to 6%, tremendously better. But what happens is that you start to look at the rate for white kids that's already lower than the total, and it's already about 2 to 1 between blacks and whites. So we have a difference that has categorically existed since 1960 that still exists. So we've come a long way. We've gotten a whole lot further in the process, and we know how to support and sustain infants who are critically ill, but we still have that splay. So when we look at deaths per 1,000 from 1995 and 2003, again, hoping that you would see some discordance, the discordance you see, again, is particularly black-white, more so than Hispanic here, but I suspect that that's different now. And interestingly, some American Indian, Native Americans. So again, we have this disparate outcomes that is related more to race and ethnicity. But our president, Barack Obama, decided that the best way that we could address this is the Affordable Care Act. It's unfortunately been labeled the Obamacare, One could argue that it probably started with Romney in Massachusetts, but we never refer to it that way. But I think there's still a lot of misconceptions about what this means, and even more so, the nomenclature. You ask somebody about Obamacare and they'll give you one opinion. If you ask them about Affordable Care, they're going to give you another opinion. And those two things very often are not necessarily in agreement. I think what we can agree upon is that, again, coming back to Dr. King's premise, that health care everyone should be entitled to, irrespective, then affordable care makes sense. I think that there are some issues with how one gets that insurance care and how much that costs. But the Affordable Care Act doesn't necessarily address or control for all of those parameters. Well, back in 1963, President Kennedy called on Congress in 1963 to pass what would eventually become the Civil Rights Act of '64, and he rattled off a string of statistics that were supposed to highlight the nation's continuing racial divide after the Emancipation Proclamation. What he said that year was that African American kids born that year about 1/2 as much a chance of completing high school as a white baby born the same place and the same day, 1/3 chance of completing college, 1/3 as much of a chance of becoming professional, twice as much of becoming unemployed, 1/7 as much a chance of earning $10,000 a year. God forbid we did that now. Life expectancy 7 years shorter, and the prospects of earning only half as much. I suspect if we took the time to go through each and every one of those little details, things probably have not changed as much as what we would have hoped. In 1963 and 64, now addressing the issue of education, it was reported graduation rates were 76.7% of the total population who were in high school, and 45% of those folks ended up going to college, and 21% graduated from college. So if you graduated from high school in 1963, you had a 1 in 5 chance of finishing college, which is really pretty abysmal given the technology and the requirements for technology in our society now. When you look at the high school graduation rates, and if we go back, this goes back to 65, 68, what you see is overall, which is the squares, around 80%, so that 76% is probably in keeping with what was realistic at that point. And now we have rates theoretically in excess of 85% total graduation. I'm going to show you some conflicting data on that. But importantly, even at that point, the white completion rate was higher than the norm or the average rate. And not surprisingly, the rate for African Americans was significantly lower initially, 25, 30% lower, and there has been some improvement, but there is still a discordance between the likelihood that a kid will even graduate from high school. What's even scarier in a sense, and this is data from 2004, is now the likelihood that a child, period, will graduate from high school. These are data that I'm showing you now from 3 states, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Massachusetts. I did that because I've done talks that use some of these points of information in all of those places. But importantly, I think what comes out of this is when you look at the rate at which kids drop out of high school in North Carolina, and this was in 2004, that's frightening to me. And I hope that it would be frightening to everyone else. I think the other thing that is poor is when you look at the percentage of kids who will actually graduate from college. So now this 20%, 21% that we saw graphically before is borne out again by these stats. Depending on where you live, depending on where your community is, depending on what school you go to, depending on the level of community support, depending on the interests of your teachers, depending on the qualifications of your teachers, depending on the support that the teachers get, depending on their salaries, depending on, you get that point. There's so many different variables that now affect whether or not or how adequately a kid is going to be educated. That's unfortunate. Interestingly, and sort of grew up in a family of educators, so I preface my comment that way. My mother pointed out to me just sort of serendipitously last night when we were talking about our family and kids going to school, that at the time that she went to school, and at the time in the 60s, it was not unusual necessarily for persons of color to go to college. Obviously that happened. But there were limitations on what one could do, very significant limitations. So as I said, I grew up in a family of educators, but it was not unusual for African American families to have teachers, nor was it unusual to have ministers. And that, my mother's side is populated with those two professions. But that was about the extent of what one could do, other than being in a service, cook, cut hair, clean. So in terms of school and in terms of school points, the endpoints look different in 1960 than they do in 2014. They look different than they did in the 70s. The 70s was really a high point for that affirmative action stuff that everybody talks about and gets their shorts in a knot. I don't think affirmative action affected my going to school, but it probably did. It probably did only in as much that educational communities were interested in diversity. It was stated or unstated. I went to Williams. I went to a small private school in New England. The first African American graduated from that school in the late 1800s. So it was not necessarily so unusual to have persons of color on that campus. And it was not so unusual necessarily to have folks who did well coming out of there. We had 25 of 525 graduates as persons of color, and virtually every one of them went to a graduate school, law school, medical school, business school, with very few exceptions. It was an expectation. What do folks expect to do now when they graduate from college? I'm not sure if I know the answer to that. But I think what is clear is that if they're not prepared to even get into college, if our education is failing our kids, then we're in trouble. When you look at graduation rates, four-year graduation rates, this was published in 2013, but what starts to get really scary is when you look at all students, close to 60%, look at what happens to particularly males and females of African American descent. So now we have disparities in education that are persisting and persistent. So not only do we have a difficult circumstance in terms of education of all kids, but in terms of kids of color, it becomes equally more alarming. So let's take them up to medical school. The reason being now, if we're going to address healthcare disparities and we're just going to start to look at diversifying the population of providers, when you look at the number of black applicants and black first-time enrollees, this was in 2012, the AAMC reported that they were at an all-time high. This was really more for persons of color, which was really pretty great. 3,824 black applicants to U.S. medical schools made up 8% of the population in the applicant pool. Since 2005, the number of black applicants to medical school increased 21%. And during the same period, the number of white applicants increased only by 13.7%. In 2012, there were 1,416 black first-time enrollees in U.S. medical schools, making up 7.3% of all entering students, an increase from 14.2% since 2005, where the increase in white students was 9.1% since 2005. All of that sounds really pretty cool and wonderful until you start to really look at it. While there are increases across the board, as reported in that data, and they showed this graph, what you see is that there's an increase in the total number of applicants over that same time period, which unfortunately wasn't reported. When you look at the number of kids who graduated, all graduates, relatively speaking, that's not a huge change. I think the thing that's even more fixed is the number of applicants. So you went up by 8%, but 8% relative to the totality in numbers really doesn't change percentages. Not in terms of applicants, not in terms of matriculants, not in terms of graduates. So when you tease out all of this information, what comes out of that is, relatively speaking, because all of the numbers went up, there was 32%, roughly speaking, white men in medical school, 25% white women. When you look at what happens with black men and black women, those numbers on average added up, end up being 7-ish, 6-ish, but across the board, really it hasn't changed since 2002. It obviously has changed since 1960. So we have made some strides in terms of getting folks in school in general and diversifying the population of students who are in school. Yet and still, we have sort of what has become more stagnant in terms of percentages. And I'm not sure if or when that will change. And those are sort of smattering of things that have happened since 1960 to us as a country, to us as a nation. I leave these questions not necessarily because I can answer them or would even deliberately try to answer them, but more to be provocative, because I think that each one of the things that I've sort of mentioned, we could spend hours discussing, whether it's violence, whether it's disparate health care, whether it's access to care, whether it's the provider or the provider population, whether or not it's simply education and educational pipelines. But does racism still exist? I think there are those who would say undoubtedly it does. I think the thing that has been very alarming for me, having been a child of the 60s in some respects and being very well aware of segregation, of racism in its most blatant form, is seeing the expression of hate that has evolved over the last decade. I think things have become more overt. I suspect if we went around the room, each of you can name at least one person who's been accused or who has been deliberately noted to say something that is racist, as a tag, as a thought process, including, what's the guy, the duck call person? I'm not going to watch his show. I think he's hammered a lot of people. So do we still have segregation, intentionally or unintentionally? You know, when I was in college, one of those things that we used to laugh about, and there was a book written about it, you know, where you sit in the cafeteria, who your friends are. Has it really changed that much? Do we feel comfortable moving from one side of the table to the other or across the room? Who are our friends? Who are our trusted colleagues? Have sexism and classism and bias to culture, religion, gender identification, or the like become a new racism? I don't think, unfortunately, you know, again, in the generation in which I was raised, one of the first things that you learned was do unto others. Church was a big part of my childhood, and I suspect for a lot of folks in here, I see a lot of head nodding. It's a very simple adage, but if everybody could do that, we would be so much closer to Dr. King's dream. But we find so many different ways to identify or to label or to hate. Bias in and of itself is not necessarily a negative thing, and it exists. We have racial bias, we have stereotypes that we've grown up with, we have a way of identifying people. We look at them and we decide because of the way that they looked, and they're probably this way, that way, or the other. That in itself is not harmful unless you let that affect how you interface with that person. So have we become more sensitive to religion or cultural differences? How many times have you seen somebody walking or driving with a head wrap, and how do you respond to them? I suspect that the way that we responded to people who look like Middle Easterners or who look Arab or Muslim or however before the Twin Towers is entirely different than we do now. And while intellectually we know that that's a silly way to decide to identify someone and respond to them, we still do. So have the ideals of Dr. King proven elusive? How far have we come? You know, I think in some respects we've made a lot of strides. We probably have come a great distance in learning about each other and in learning about our differences. And there are points, I think, where we have been able to actually make a difference. As I said, I'm not going to try to answer those questions because it would take entirely too long and I probably never could. But I think we can all make a difference and we can all work toward Dr. King's dreams. I think we can reach deep. We can look at education more seriously and encourage the development of our community's educational systems, particularly under grade 12. Little kids, 3rd, 5th graders, now can't read or don't read the same way that we used to at that point. Write. Why bother to write when you have a keyboard? Spell check, okay. I remember reading my son's paper and thinking, well, you could make this so much better. And he was horrified. My teacher doesn't care about the spelling. I do. I did. Mentor and care. There are folks here or around in colleges and high school. There are folks who really want to achieve. And there are folks who really need to know that they can achieve. So take every opportunity that you can to reach down and help someone. Be knowledgeable about the issues that affect our communities, irrespective of age. I've become keenly aware of senior moments, or through senior moments, of the kinds of issues that affect those advanced in age. I can proudly say that my mom just celebrated her 90th birthday. Reach, teach, and encourage. I see some smiling faces among us who I know make it a life's mission to make sure that they help folks, either through education or through care. Give willingly of the blessings that have been provided to you. We only get to come around once, and this is a one-act play, and it's not going to be restaged. With that, I'll close. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you today.
Are there any questions for Dr. Wigfall? Thank you so very much for that enlightening discussion. I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge some individuals who, without them, this program could not have be as successful as it was. Anthony Dahl, great setup from IT. We thank him very, very much. He's behind closed doors. We had Kathy Cooksey from the facility staff, and that awesome presentation from Victor, Lena, and Cassandra. Thank you so, so very much. We appreciate that. And also our photographer, Mr. Seth Moserkatz. We thank you for your assistance and help today. So there are refreshments outside the door for those of you who may not have seen that when you came in. And again, thank you so much for coming out and for celebrating MLK Day with us today. Have a great one.